Is this better than landscape designer Andy Sturgeon, whose expertise earned him his 5th gold and best in show at Chelsea this year. So when we came across an unusual garden in Surrey with a distinguished design pedigree, we sent him along to check it out.
When you think about department stores, you don't tend to think about landscape design. But in fact, here in Guildford, you'd be wrong. Five floors up amongst the rolling hills of Surrey is a rooftop water garden. Roof gardens all have a certain magic about them, even though they've become relatively commonplace these days. But what's important about this one is that it was one of the first, and it was designed by one of the greatest landscape architects of the 20th century. So Jellicoe designed some of our best-known landscapes, including Sutton Place, the canal at Wisley, and this, in 1957, the roof of what was then Harvey's department store. The garden's current custodian, Joe Botibol, has unearthed some of its history. Joe, although I've never been here before, I'm pretty familiar with this garden from having seen it in books and things over the years. At least I thought I was familiar, because in fact this doesn't look anything like how I expected to see it.
It has changed dramatically. The garden has shortened probably by a third. A lot of the original planting were mainly, as we would think, bedding plants, like our red salvias and just tulips.
And what about the cafes and restaurants and things? Because that's obviously all different too.
Oh, it was a novelty at the time, because when they opened, they had one of the very first Italian restaurants with an ice cream parlour on top.
So was this a place to be seen
Oh,
then?
definitely a place to be seen. You're going back to the stages of where the whole family used to go out, and they'd spend all day looking for Mum's new winter coat, for example, and then go and have a triumphant tea or a lunch afterwards.
So when did it change then?
Well, in the late 70s, unfortunately, the garden fell into disrepair, and in fact the restaurant and the garden up here were closed off to the public. But in the refurbishment of the year 2000, the garden was shortened somewhat.
And the planting's all become new at that point then, has it?
Well, given the perfect opportunity to actually introduce a lot more plants, new plants that we haven't used up here before.
There's a lot of grasses like this carex, aren't there?
Absolutely, the carrots and steepers.
They've also got that watery quality, even the ones in pots. It gives the whole thing a very naturalistic feel, doesn't it? These concrete stepping stones and the gently bubbling fiberglass water bowls here are the iconic elements of this garden. They've got a real 50s quality about them, kind of Festival of Britain. And although they date the garden, I still think they work rather well. They've stood the test of time. This place was designed as a sky garden, a sort of meeting place between heaven and earth. But to really appreciate the design, you have to see it from above. When Jellicoe first designed this garden, up here there was a viewing platform, and you can see why, because when you look down upon the garden, it's actually far more impressive, and you can really begin to understand it. All these strong shapes and circles, they actually represented the planet in honour of the first Sputnik that was launched. But it also gives the garden a real structure, and as you look around, it gives it real shape, and the soft planting's a wonderful balance to that. I've been inspired by much of his work, but this garden is important because it's conceptual. It's based on one idea, and that makes Jellicoe and this garden well ahead of their time.
Finesse.